Hi, everyone. My name is Bara Vaida. I'm the Director of Training for the National Press Club Journalism Institute, the nonprofit affiliate of the National Press Club, and we aim to power journalism in the public interest. We're so glad to have you here today for today's program, Journalism Work, Separating Your Career from Your Identity. 2024 has been a brutal start in terms of journalism job losses, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation. Before we get started, please drop us a note in the chat. Just tell us where you're tuning in from. The chat box is also where we'll be taking questions. So please feel free to drop your questions in there throughout this webinar. We'll be monitoring them. And so we're our speakers. We'll also have a live transcript option available to you at any time during this program, and the instructions are in the chat. This program is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to you. Highlights from the program will also appear on our website and in our newsletter with the video. If you aren't already receiving the Institute's daily newsletter for journalists, it's free and you can subscribe now. Again, please share your questions and comments in the chat rather than the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring the chat and responding to questions. Our panelists will be in conversation for about 30 minutes or so, and then they'll open it up for your questions. And now it's my honor to introduce these two accomplished speakers. In the interest of time, I won't read out their full bios, but I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. Our first speaker and the moderator is Kate Woodson, most recently with the Washington Post. Kate pioneered a mental health column and managed a short documentary unit for Post Opinions. And she was part of the Pulitzer-winning team that covered the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Our other speaker is Jenna Koretz. She's a psychologist and the founder of Azimuth, which provides therapy focused on the unique challenges of individuals in high pressure careers, including burnout, values, career enmeshment. And I want to thank you both for being here. I'm going to hand this over to Kate now, who will frame this discussion and begin the conversation with Dr. Koretz.
Thank you, Bara, Jenna, and everybody who's joining us, even from Zambia and Staunton, Virginia. We've got a wide group of people, so thank you. This is a conversation for people who take so much pride or put so much stake into their career, their professional success, that it becomes the main or primary source of self-worth. It's for people who have found themselves defined more by what they do or what they accomplish than by who they intrinsically are. So in the next 45 minutes, John and I are going to be digging into the concept of professional enmeshment, the costs and benefits of tying our identity to our career, and how to navigate the challenges and possibilities that unfold when we burn out, when we're laid off, when we retire, or even when we become disillusioned with the organization that we have valued above ourselves. This should sound pretty familiar to the journalists and editors out there, particularly as we've been in a decade of contraction in our industry with thousands of jobs cut last year and a nonstop call for the first few months of this year. So Jana, I want to start. You're a psychologist who focuses on people who are so committed to their career that their relationship with their job can compromise the health of other relationships, including with themselves. Explain what is career enmeshment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really happy to be here talking about this with you guys because I do really think it's a problem that a lot of people are suffering from and not a lot of people are talking about. Because when people hear the word enmeshment, I think they tend to think about codependent relationships or things like that, when really enmeshment is about the blurring of boundaries of self and something else. And oftentimes we talk about that in relation to another person, or occasionally for things like motherhood or things like that. But really the conversation has not been about how that happens with work and how those lines become blurred over time, which is really interesting to me because in general, we live in a work culture that's extremely tough. The value that our culture in general places on accomplishments, job titles, and things like that is huge. And taking vacation, for a long time has been really looked down upon. And I think a little bit of that is changing over time. Especially with like the World Health Organization declaring burnout as an actual condition. With COVID over the last couple of years, people have been forced to kind of reconcile a little bit about what are boundaries, both in terms of physical space and doing work, and also when they're doing work, how they're thinking about work and things like that. tends to be how we at our practice talk about work enmeshment in that way of just the boundary between self and work is minimal or non-existent.
So when you're saying the boundary between self and work, I'm going to self-acknowledge I'm a recovering workaholic. And this concept of boundary between self and work is once upon a time very foreign to me, because the work is a mission to me. It is my value system is based on holding people accountable, empowering people. And so if that is what fulfills me as a human being, why should I have a boundary with the job that enables me to live that value?
Sure, that's a really good question. I think that's true for a lot of people. They have these chosen careers because it's important to them for one reason or another. And oftentimes it is a value that they have personally. It's not like a value that's placed upon them by an outside force like family of origin or culture. And I think what gets tricky is that those personal values that you have can be found not just through work. And I think if we find a job that works well with our values, it's easy to find that fulfillment in that piece of it, which is great until it becomes not so great when there are layoffs or other kinds of problems. You know, companies get acquired, all sorts of things happen over time where people have families. Like there are a lot of things that happen where people don't get to put themselves into work in the way they used to. And therefore, then all of their values piece and things that they really hold important are tied up in something that they're not doing anymore, or they're doing it differently. And they don't have that piece in other parts of their life, like all their eggs are in that one basket. So it's not so much like the actual boundary in that way is a problem, but it usually becomes a problem over time. And then people are so ingrained in this one space that they can't find that fulfillment in something else.
When things are good, when there are no layoffs and you're doing great at your job, that the enmeshment seems like an additive, value in your life. But how should we start to notice when the lines are blurred between self and job, and how do we develop a stronger sense of self in the healthier times, so that when there is a sudden unexpected change, we're not caught off guard?
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right? Because people typically, when they come to see us, let's say something has happened, there has been an event of some sort, and that could be layoffs or company acquisition, like I said, or it's a partner saying, like, I'm not going on vacation with you anymore if you don't stop working when we're on vacation, or some kind of not ultimatum per se, but some kind of strong boundary about, or people are noticing something about you, or your kids are making comments, or you're missing a lot of things and you're starting to notice that and you feel badly about that. So typically there's something that has happened, or at work you miss a promotion, or just things happen where you start to feel it in a really negative way. And so that typically can be one way in which people start to realize that it's a problem for them. Another way that I talk about a lot with people is when you're out, even if you're at work and you're just talking about things you like to do, or people ask about what you do for fun or hobbies or things like that, if you can't come up with something that isn't work related, that's a really good indication that that's where you're at. And I personally have suffered from that too. I remember being at a party a long time ago when I had started the company where I had a full caseload and I was running the company, and someone asked me what I did for fun. And honestly, it was a little hard not to laugh at them because I was like, fun, what do you mean? I spent all my time doing these other things. And I was a little embarrassed, honestly. I like made something up about it, but it really made me think about how my time was spent. And I wasn't able to make a change around that for a long time, but it helped me understand a little bit more about where I was in that way.
Yeah, I have faced that question, and I find my job fun. It's intellectually stimulating, it's creative, my work is fun. And so I've often considered my career my hobby, which is, again, potentially problematic if something happens to my career. So what are, in the patients that you work with, in looking at society, what are the drawbacks? What are the mental health challenges that come with enmeshing our identities with our job or our professional success?
I think often we find that when people do have that taken from them, or they start to question that piece, your identity is your identity. So it becomes a very existential question about who am I? What am I doing? Why am I here? What is my purpose? And a lot can come from those kinds of questions. If we've, I've been there, but we've all kind of had moments like that where we think about things in a bigger way. And that can make people really, honestly, a little depressed, anxious. People can start, using substances more. It can bring up a lot of trauma for people. It can be, it kind of has these varying ways in which it impacts people, but typically the existential piece, I think, leads people into more of like the mental health components, like that I mentioned.
Yeah, and I'll give a personal anecdote. I covered the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol and had quite a negative experience and was surrounded and threatened by some Trump supporters. And I needed to take time off. I needed to pull back to focus on my mental and physical health. And I went through a period of reflection about whether or not I wanted to continue in journalism, whether journalism was safe. Did I think that we were making a difference? And I actually, one of the questions that I posed to myself is, will my friends still like me if I'm not a journalist? Which was ludicrous because I have a beautiful, supportive community of friends. But when I dug down into that question, I realized that I had to ask myself, will I like myself if I'm not a journalist? And that then opened up another layer of inquiry of why am I addicted to my job? Why does my self-worth come from accomplishment and working all the time? And I had to look at, much older stories and personal experiences that date back to childhood in my family of origin of not necessarily feeling safe or not necessarily feeling lovable, but I got all of those positive affirmations from work instead of home. How important is it, if we want to develop a healthy sense of self, to scour the basement to figure out what's contributing to this drive, to this connection? And I know it's not the same for everybody, but in fixing this or soothing it or helping it, what are the social societal factors that are pushing on it, and what are the intrinsic family factors that are contributing?
Well, I think there's two answers to your question, because I think for some people that basement piece is important. I mean, and as a therapist, like I think that's important for everyone for a lot of reasons, not just in this way, because there's a lot there, and people I think often don't realize how much has been put on them by family of origin or culture where they're from, or how they've received what they've needed through work, because they haven't had the opportunity to think about that, or it hasn't come up before. They didn't know that they could think about it that way. So there are all these things that do happen over time. But there's also more of like a now piece, because people also change over time. So we can also see that, people's values can change over time, or things that are important to them or what they have time for can change over time, which can lead to this discomfort and feeling of dissonance between work-related things and self. So there's also if you're thinking about more of a now component and digging into that, I think the values piece is really important. We do a lot of work around values, and it's actually a big part of acceptance and commitment therapy, which we can talk, I have a lot to say about, and I love it, but really figuring out what is important to me, why is it important to me, how am I going to find those things in a variety of places, because it really can't be just one place. And that's a long-term plan. That takes a little while to figure it out. And I think it takes a lot of trial and error, small steps. I think people really don't like that either. But, because we'll have people that we see who, they get laid off, let's say, and they're like, all right, well, I think fitness is important to me, so I'm going to sign up for a marathon. And that's fine and great. That's a really big accomplishment, but we're also talking about ways to figure out what's important to you. You can also just try exercise, like see how that fits into your life. Doesn't have to be these big grand gestures. If we're talking about sustainability and integrating different parts of yourself and figuring out not only what is important to you, but also what isn't important to you. Trying things out in a small way is a much easier way to do that. And I think a lot happens in those small steps, and it's really unfulfilling for people, because I think they're looking for a change and a big, they want that feeling of change and hope and things like that. And I think that doesn't always come with the small steps, but that's actually how you get there.
It's interesting. I'm looking at the chat, and Kateri Wozni, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, she says it's adrenaline and used to be being on all the time, working in the press all these years. And what resonates with me on that is you also get addicted to the adrenaline, right? You get these rushes on deadline, you get these rushes when you have a good story out or that you make change. So maybe, if you're asking us to look at our value system separate from our job, maybe we like to feel energized by making change, or if we can get that boost of adrenaline from something else, is what I'm hearing you say. Is look at what we like and then look to other areas as well to feed that. Megan Horsted said, I found that my career has been very empowering for me as a person of color who may otherwise feel powerless in the world. So I look at this job as a way of giving me the power to hold the powerful accountable for the actions. She is empowered and she's holding somebody accountable. Those are values that we can live outside of journalism, but there is a certain prestige and access that I think in some ways journalists and editors find themselves to be exceptional, because we have access and the ability to make change in a way that many others don't. When that is taken away from us suddenly, for example, by layoffs, job cuts, retirement, that's a shock to the system. And you experience a range of emotions. What kind of emotions should people expect to be feeling, or might they notice are happening with them right now?
Yeah, I think that acute period is a difficult one for obvious reasons, but also because if you have something so important taken away, you feel lost, you feel hopeless, you feel angry, you can feel all sorts of ways. And I think what can happen is people get this flood of negativity inside and they feel confused and they panic and they don't know how to proceed. And then I think it's often followed by this idea of like getting away from that, like feeling overwhelmed by these feelings, trying to push them away and like find another way to manage or cope or do something else, which doesn't actually help a lot. Because I mean, when something that big happens to you, it's with you. You can't escape that. And I think setting the expectation that you're going to feel poorly, whatever that means to you. It's going to be very hard to manage, but you can feel that and also work on other pieces to make yourself feel better or to solve problems. And so figuring out how to do both is really important, and being self-compassionate, because oftentimes a lot of these things have nothing to do with us. People lose their jobs all the time for all sorts of reasons, for journalism is a little more specific, but I mean, private equity is buying up all sorts of stuff and they just fire people because they don't even know their names. It's just because it's like a bottom line issue. All they care about is the P&L, right? And so that has nothing to do with what skills a person has. It's just they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so having some compassion around yourself and that you have these skills and you can identify as a journalist, but also you're also someone who does journalism and you do other things. And how do we find those skills? What are those skills? Can you apply them in other places, and working more on like problem solving in a self-compassionate way? It
Yeah.
sounds like a really therapist-y thing to say, but it is important, I think.
It's incredibly important. And I want to get specific with an anecdote from the Post. The Washington Post lost $100 million last year. And despite being owned by Jeff Bezos, the company cut 240 jobs by offering buyouts. And what happened in the process of the buyout period when people had to decide whether or not to take this opportunity? An incredible community grew from the journalists and editors within the newsroom, but also from former Post employees who had been through layoffs and buyouts before. And they put together a resource of wisdom and comments and suggestions from people who had experienced this same loss. And one of the most helpful things that I found in this package of reflections was people saying, I felt rage, I felt shame, I felt loss, I felt betrayal. And when I saw, this esteemed journalist who had been at the paper for 20 plus years, and I thought he has a great career after the Post, that he went through a period of anger and shame. And it made me feel, oh, I'm not alone in this, number one, which is really important to me. And number two, it's normal to feel these things. And then what you're saying, it's not my fault, which I think no matter what, when you are cut from a position or when you opt to take a position, you still wonder, why was I offered the buyout? What is it about me? And I think particularly for journalists, because we are in it for the cause, for the mission, we put our health and safety on the line for democracy. When we come in against the reality that we are working for a company, it does feel like betrayal. Like I gave my health to you and you don't care who I am or what I've done. How important is it to grieve?
I think it's very important to grieve. I think that looks really different for a lot of people. Similar to any other traumatic event, grief is very specific to a person and it's not consistent either. So it kind of pops up here and there in places you don't necessarily expect it to show up. And I think the acknowledgement and the grief piece, and to your point, I think there's something so profoundly important about a shared experience. And to find support in that way, I think is really helpful in grief and just in these situations in general, because there is just something about someone who knows exactly what it is and can say, yeah, I felt betrayal too. And you can say, oh, thank God, it's like not just me,
Right.
and this is bigger than me. And I think that's so important. And I'm so glad to hear about that resource because we talk about this all the time. It's just, you need to find one person. It can be anybody, like even if it's someone on the internet who lives in Japan, like it doesn't matter. It has to be somebody because I know a lot about these things, let's say, but I don't know what it's like to be in your position. That hasn't happened to me. And so
Right.
it's really important to find those people and use that as part of your grief support network.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to have other journalists, people in journalism, as well as others who are in industries that they feel that are burning them out. I know a number of people in nonprofits who are completely burnt out, but feel committed to the cause and feel like the nonprofit will collapse if they leave. And having that perspective outside of my industry also is helpful to recognize, oh, this isn't just me. So it's the micro macro. One resource that I found very helpful is created by the American Press Institute. Samantha Ragland has done incredible work there on the hazards that journalists face. And I'm not talking about covering war, talking about, the hazard of burnout, working within an industry that is shrinking and taking away resources while asking you to do more. She suggested that in trying to understand what we're experiencing in burnout, and I think this also applies to job loss or the feelings we experience when we can no longer do the thing that defined us, is getting down into emotional granularity. And she has this wheel that she's put together from a number of resources that have different names of different emotions. Because I think when it can feel when we're going through massive change or loss or exhaustion, it just feels like television static. And so actually looking at this wheel of emotional granularity to figure out what is it that we're feeling, to then be able to have a name for it, explain it to someone else, and then figure out how to treat it. That has been helpful to me. I also want to talk about kind of the triage. If you have lost your job, or even if you haven't lost your job, but you're thinking of leaving your job, or you're afraid of losing your job, what are the things that we can do to begin to shore up ourselves a little bit to lessen the blow of a big change?
I think like in any acute event, like I sometimes liken this to medicine, but let's say, you're in a car accident and you go to the hospital, like the first thing you have to do is be stabilized. And then they set your leg and then you go home and start PT. And I think that is that kind of stepwise fashion when you think about things like this is helpful because the first thing that you need to do is figure out a way to stabilize, whatever that means. And it depends a little bit about whether or not you've chosen to leave or been laid off or what have you, but being very solution focused about like, what are my immediate needs right now? Like, I need this job for my money, right? So like, how can I fix that problem? Okay, now I need this job because it's really important to me to be, writing things that are real and important and to informing the public and all of that. So like, how can I get that? Where can I get that? And kind of figure out how to just be stable for the moment in the logistics, never mind the emotional components. And then in regards to the emotional piece, then you have a little more space, right? Because you've taken out the pieces of logistics that weigh so heavily on us when we do switch jobs or get laid off. I think again, this is such a therapist thing to say, but, and as someone who mindfulness does not come naturally to me at all. It's just not something that resonates with my personality naturally, and it's something I have had to practice over time. But a lot of emotional dysregulation is not about right now. It's about what has happened, and it is about things that we worry about in the future. But in this actual moment, aside from the discomfort of an event, let's say, like a lot of that is not about right in this moment. And so if you're able to focus in the moment and figure out how to practice doing that, even if it's just a little bit, that really helps kind of remove some of the burden of the emotional components so that there's a little space for maybe levity, but also problem solving and taking a step back and thinking more broadly about how this has happened and what it means and finding support and things like that. I think those pieces are really important.
That's super helpful. I'll share another anecdote to make this real. I took the buyout from the Washington Post, and even though I was ready to go and had been through a process of about 3 years of assessing my values and whether or not I was being measured by metrics of success that I also shared, taking the buyout and going from having a community, a job I report to, known metrics of success, stable financial income, insurance that I know is there, to the next day having it be completely different, was I'm not going to say extraordinarily destabilizing. It was disorienting, very disorienting. Less so because I was ready, but I still realized I immediately got into this scarcity mindset of I'm only valuable if I'm doing, if I'm making, if I'm, if I'm a human doing, not a human being. And also, is there going to be enough anything for me going around? And so immediately I announced I'm creating a Substack, I'm going to write a book, I'm producing films, and I'm consulting, all of which will be true eventually. But the desire to announce that even though I don't have this job, I still have these big plans was a way of controlling my own narrative when I had lost control of the story I had written about myself.
Yeah.
But what I found is that I was recreating the frenetic energy and culture that I was actively choosing to leave. And so for anybody who has just left or maybe leaving, these are some of the things that helped me. It was kind of a hierarchy of needs. I needed to figure out a budget. I needed to figure out my finances of how much money do I need each month. So how much money do I need to bring in? Can I start thinking about a dream job, or do I need to immediately start to hustle and get some work? And that job might not be the same thing as the job that reflects my values, but I need to stabilize just enough so I'm covering the bills and not freaking out. So that was one key thing. Community was really important. Before I left the Post, and I would recommend this to anybody who has not left, download all your contacts if it's legal, take the resources that are legal, make sure that you know that you have a network of people that you can reach out to. Contact your friends, contact your family, even if it's to say, I'm going through change. It's going to be really important. Even introverts, tell your cat, say it out loud. And then, like you said, mindfulness and body, I had to move each day to get my container strong. And then spirit for me was having a feeling of awe, something that made me feel like the world is bigger than the universe I had been focused on. And also that changed my sense of what is possible. And so that can come from going into nature or listening to music. I went into a hot air balloon and floated above 1,500-year-old pyramids in Mexico. I was very fortunate to be able to do that. But I needed that perspective shift to remind me the world is bigger than the Post, the world is bigger than journalism, the world is bigger than DC. All of that will look different for different people. And
Can I add something to that? Because that's
exactly, I want you to, yeah.
That is so important. And I love your idea of perspective. And I always remind people that perspective is how we learn and we grow. And it's really important when you're thinking about fulfilling life, like you need perspective from all sorts of ways, but it always comes at a really high cost, like every single time. And so, which is unfair, but I think that's just how the world works. And so part of like, I think when these things happen, all we can feel is the loss, right? We just feel what has been lost, but we don't yet know what has been gained because there's always something to have been gained or will be gained or change. And, this is when the networking happens, you get this job from a guy, and like, that's how things happen. But we get so burdened by the lack of and the change, and we don't see what the positive is from it because it hasn't happened yet. And I just like to remind people to keep that perspective piece in mind, like everything has a cost, but what comes from things like this often is really helpful. And sort of what you're talking about, like the world is bigger, like what does this mean for me? And like being able to become grounded by that and then figure out what is next is really
Yep.
important. And then you have a better sense of that grounding because you've been through that experience.
I think that's right. And people in the journalism industry are technically good at reporting, gathering information, and then organizing it, making order out of chaos. And so our job essentially is to do the reporting on our own lives, gather the data of what are our direct needs, and include in those direct needs seeking awe, physical health, mental health. One of the questions that came in is, how do I maintain my pressing matters at work without letting them headline my personal life? So does that make sense to you? How
Like
do I
if
make sure that I maintain the boundary between the big stuff at work running over my personal life?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has to decide what boundaries are possible given the nature of their work and what they want it to look like. Because I think journalism is a little tricky, right? Because there are deadlines and there are times where you have to do certain things, and you don't always have the flexibility to say it's 6 o'clock, I'm going to put this down and not pick it up until tomorrow. But the extent that people can say like, you know, I'm just making this up, but like my partner really comes home from work at 7:30, and from like 7:30 to 8:45, like I'm turning off my phone. I'm not looking at anything on the internet. We're just going to talk to each other. And usually we watch Netflix during that time, or I'm like working at the same time, kind of multitasking, but instead I'm going to do this one thing. And it doesn't have to be that long. And so I think you have to figure out what is possible within where you're working and then hold really true to that. And don't, I think a lot of people feel like bullied into changing it for a lot of reasons because everyone has their own securities around those boundaries. But if you know that they're safe to do because you're not going to miss the deadline or, for whatever reason for your own industry standard, then I think you just make the boundary and it's non-negotiable. You just have to keep it.
Yeah, I think that is easier said than done. I like the idea. One thing I will say to this person who's asking that, how do you maintain the boundary between work and life? I think it's multi-tiered. One is looking honestly at yourself and seeing what are the things in your life that the work is taking precedence over. And so, for example, if you have kids, you're probably going to feed your kids before you do XYZ at work. I hope you will. If your work has become so big that you don't have other things to focus on or that might be taking your time up, that is a really important piece of data. So I could fill my time all the time with work because I let it completely consume me. I wasn't really sacrificing anything by doing the work at home. So that was one part of the calculation, is gathering the data about when I'm prioritizing this work, what is it taking over or what has it, consumed. The So that's noticing it and establishing what is my value. If I'm valuing my health, then maybe I need to actually schedule something so that I am not free to do that work. You can put time on your calendar, for example, to go exercise, meet a friend, XYZ, and you don't have to tell somebody that it's for health, but actually I would encourage you to do it. And then the other a boss, a colleague, a peer, and say, my audio is out. I am talking like a robot.
I can hear you now. I
Did you hear?
missed the I got like a little bit of what you were saying, and I was trying to read your lips, but I can see it now.
And now my thumb's downing. I think it's figure out if you have, what are you valuing above yourself? Have that conversation with yourself, schedule something so that you have to do something else other than work, and then have that conversation with a boss or a peer to say, I need to start to focus on something else besides work, outside of work. It's tricky.
It's tricky because I think it also has to do, if you're talking about values, right? That also takes a while to think about those things, like how do I want to spend my time? What are they? How can I get there? How can I schedule over this time? Like you're saying, it is a process.
When you say values, what is a value and how do you begin to recognize them? If I'm trying to create a system that doesn't replicate the newsroom I just left, what is the process to begin that?
I think thinking about, I mean, there's a lot of tools to do that online, and we have one on our website as well, just to get the conversation going of like how what are even the possibilities of what a value is, right? Because the way we talk about values is things that are inherently important to our character and morals, and then and the actions we choose that correlate with that. And that's a really big question, to even know about. And so I think sitting for a minute and just thinking about, like, we try to do this imagination exercise, right? So if you had all the money in the world all the time, there's no like constraints for you, what is it you would actually be doing? And even if the answer is your job, take that a step further. And well, what is it about the job? So you've figured out it's the adrenaline, it's the prestige, it's the accolades. Okay, and so is accolades really important to me, or is it important to me because I was told it was important to me, or because I don't have something else, or because, for all the reasons you personally stated, right? There's a lot of and so there's a line of inquiry that you can start doing about what you actually want to spend your time doing without, logistical constraints, what that would look like, and why is that true for you, and the more you learn and think about, and I think this is also where support systems come into place, because it's really nice to iterate with someone else on this. You start to see, oh, like this is actually because of something else. I actually don't value this that much anymore. Or, oh, it didn't occur to me that, family is a value of mine, but I'm not actually living in alignment with that, because I think I am by like providing for my kids, let's say, but I'm also missing this other component, like my presence, that's important too. So like, how do I reconcile those pieces? So a lot of it is these big questions that you sort of have to make smaller and smaller. And then I think it becomes more obvious to people, or they choose a path and then they start to live in that way. And then it feels right or it doesn't. And then they take a step back or they moderate.
And, if you're a visual person, Elaine Welcher-Roth, who was the former editor of Teen Vogue, suggests doing a mind map where you actually draw circles, where you talk about, your values, and then spin out from there. And then what do you do with your values? What is the action that you do with them? That can be very helpful. A question came in, we only have about 5 more minutes. A question came in about, what are your thoughts about repeating affirmations or changing the mental narrative about what is constantly being repeated internally in the mind? Any tips to do that authentically?
So the question being, if you have sort of these intrusive thoughts that are not helpful, how would we go about changing those thoughts or thinking about them differently?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to think about the internal dialogue also as a product of both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. And I know it's a little different, right? Because people come to us often come because something has happened and it's a little different. But even personally, I know a lot of my own intrusive thoughts are not actually about things that bother me right now, or they are not about things that I need to be worried about right now, or they're things that might not be true. And so I think a lot of it is about self-doubt or working harder, not being enough. There's a lot of intrusive thoughts people have about not being enough, not contributing enough at work and all of that. And then it is hard to do this in an authentic way because again, I think taking a step back and realizing that you're a person and you're your own person.
Mhm.
And you may not know what that means, but you are worthy and valuable as you are. And figuring out how to really commit to that and believe that, either by doing or thinking or reading or, various action steps, so that you can get to a place where you feel comfortable holding boundaries or changing the narrative or trying out a different narrative, right? I think sometimes it's a little bit people feel a little awkward about thinking about things differently because there's so many reasons why you think about things the way you do for safety, even if they're not helpful anymore. And so trying out a different narrative, like what would it feel like if, I changed my narrative about not being enough to, well, this is definitely good enough. Look at all these things I've done, right? And starting to even just conceptualize, like practice thinking about it that way is actually important because it's awkward.
Yeah, and I love your answer, and I love the question of how to do it authentically. I think for me, it is identifying the limiting belief or what I would say is the lie I'm telling myself. Like I am not worthy if I'm not working 60 hours a week, or what is the lie? What is the limiting belief? Why do I think that? And then what is the truth? And I think when I do that process to identify what I would consider to be a false narrative, and then I actually bring facts and truth to it, that's where I find the authentic affirmation. And so I think, that could be a helpful exercise for
Yeah.
people.
I agree. And I think it's important to know that just because you think it doesn't mean it's true. And to
Mhm.
your point, like looking for the evidence, what is the truth to this is so important. And I mean, you guys are really good at that. But it's hard to apply to yourself. But we take all of our thoughts as true, and most of the time they're actually not.
I think it's really hard, and we're getting a heads up that we're beginning to wrap. I know one of the things that Bara wanted us to ask the panel is, after watching this, thinking about it, what is something that you might change or do because of what you've learned here? She's asking, could you share in the chat, because of this conversation, and maybe it's because of this conversation, I will eat a pint of ice cream because I'm still feeling completely out of control in my life. But are there other things that you're gaining from this conversation? Let us know in the chat. And I should hand it back to Bara. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. This is really, really interesting. And I love to be part of these conversations.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much for the folks who shared some of the things that they do for themselves. It's just been really great to see different things that people do, from hiking to, looking into their values to recommendations to one another. I was so glad to see some of the advice people are offering one another. And I know, Jenna, you've said that you are willing to offer more advice if there are folks who'd like to continue this conversation with you, and that we can share your email address in the chat. And I really want to thank you again for being here, for the participants. We will share a link to the recording of this soon this afternoon. And so you can keep mining this conversation for guidance. And for those of you who are local in the Washington, D.C. area, I'm going to be leading a movement and meditation class at the National Press Club. We'd love to have you there. I'd love to have you join us. And we just want to thank you again all for being here. To please stay well, and we hope that we see you at another National Press Club Journalism Institute soon.
Thanks.